Let's dive into something that, well, it touches every part of our lives, really, from the prices you pay to, the stability of our jobs. When you look at the global economy, you see reports about inflation, recessions, or these incredible wealth disparities. Have you ever just stopped and wondered, why? Why does it work this way? Okay. Today, we're taking a deep dive into an economic framework that, well, it promises to answer those very questions: Marxist economics. Now, for this deep dive, we've pulled together a pretty rich collection of sources. We've got articles, videos, and key excerpts from significant books, all exploring the core ideas of Marxist economic theory, tracing how it developed historically, and laying out its critiques of capitalism. Our mission, really, is to cut through the complexity. We want to distill the most important nuggets of knowledge for you, help you grasp the fundamental concepts, understand the historical context, and see how this perspective analyzes, our current economic landscape, all without getting too bogged down in jargon.
Yeah, and it's truly compelling when you look at how Karl Marx, building on the work of earlier economic thinkers, really set out to uncover what he saw as the fundamental laws driving the capitalist system. Our sources show us how this perspective offers a unique and often critical lens, a way to view the economic realities we navigate daily, giving a deeper understanding of its sort of inner workings.
Okay, so to really get this framework, we need to start where the sources do. We need to define capitalism itself, but through this specific Marxist lens. It's described as basically an economic system built on competition, private ownership of the means of production, and this is critical, producing goods and services primarily for profit. But, the source is just Marx wasn't just starting from scratch, right? He built upon foundations laid by earlier thinkers. Who were these predecessors? What were the key insights they had that Marx then kind of took to a whole new level?
That's absolutely right. He definitely stood on the shoulders of giants. We're talking specifically about the British classical economists, people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, major Enlightenment thinkers. And they'd already grasped a really profound idea that labor, actual human effort, was the fundamental source of all new value created within society. That was a crucial step.
Okay, so Smith and Ricardo laid some groundwork there. Labor creates value. So what was Marx's big contribution? How did he develop what we now call the labor theory of value? How did he move beyond just that initial observation?
Well, Marx took those initial insights and he really rigorously developed them. As the sources put it, his genius was in trying to strip away the mysticism surrounding capitalism. He aimed to uncover its inner processes, its emergent laws, and its intrinsic contradictions. You see this detailed in his massive economic writings, like the 3 volumes of Capital. So he didn't just say labor created value, he systematized it. He argued the value of any commodity is determined by the socially necessary labor time needed to produce it.
Right, the socially necessary part, that's a crucial distinction. And in doing that, the sources say he tackled this enigma that had kind of stumped those classical economists.
Yeah.
Where does profit actually come from? This wasn't just like an accounting question for Marx, was it?
No, not at all. For the classical economists, profit was. Well, it was a bit mysterious. Marx's resolution to this puzzle is absolutely foundational to his entire critique of capitalism. He argued that profit, from his perspective, arises from exploitation, specifically from what he termed surplus value produced by the working class. The sources clarify this quite starkly, actually. They say the capitalist profits are obtained from the unpaid labor of the workers.
Wow, okay. That's a really powerful profit from exploitation from unpaid labor. Could you unpack that a bit more? How,
Yeah.
according to these sources, does unpaid labor specifically turn into profit for the capitalists? It sounds quite radical.
It definitely is a radical assertion. Let's try an example. Imagine a worker, right? Their labor, over a whole day, creates enough value to cover their own wage in maybe just the first few hours. Let's say by lunchtime, they've produced goods worth the equivalent of their full 8-hour pay. From Marx's viewpoint, any value created by that worker during the rest of the workday, those hours beyond what's needed to cover their wage, that's surplus value. And the surplus value, it's then taken or appropriated by the capitalist. That becomes the source of their profit. So you see, it's not just an accounting thing. It's presented as the core reason why profit isn't simply earned, but is fundamentally extracted from labor. And this, the argument goes, leads to inherent inequalities built right into the system.
Okay, I see the logic there from that perspective. And from that insight, the sources say Marx drew an even bigger conclusion, something they call shattering, that the capitalist system isn't just flawed, but inherently prone to periodic crisis of overproduction. That's a very strong claim. How did the sources explain this? Inevitability.
Sure. Right, he argued these crises aren't random. They break out and paralyze the entirety of society, as one source vividly puts it. essentially the capacity to produce goods, what Marx called the forces of production. It's always expanding under capitalism. It's driven by competition, the need to accumulate capital. But at the same time, the system, because it extracts that surplus value and inherently limits workers' buying power, restricts the market's ability to actually absorb all these goods. So these huge productive forces inevitably, he argued, crash up against the narrow limits of the market. This isn't just observing boom-bust cycles. It's a claim that the system has to fail periodically, not because of external factors, but because of its own internal logic. The sources connect this directly to today, observing how, quote, workers and youth are forced to pay for the crisis of capitalism, highlighting what they see as a recurring pattern.
Okay, so we have these core concepts: labor value, surplus value leading to profit via exploitation, and these inherent crises. With that foundation, it's really illuminating to see how this Marxist framework engages with, and yeah, often sharply critiques other big economic ideas. How does it compare, for instance, with Keynesianism? We're probably all familiar with J.M. Keynes, right? His theories, especially about government stimulus and managing demand, they got a lot of attention again after the 2008 crash and more recently with the pandemic. What's the Marxist take on Keynes based on our sources?
Well, the sources present a very critical viewpoint, actually. They argue that despite Keynes's huge influence, he was, quote, no friend of the working class. From this perspective, Keynesian policies like government spending to boost demand are seen as just temporary fixes, like putting a bandage on a deep wound. They argue it manages the symptoms of capitalism's contradictions, but doesn't offer a fundamental cure. The sources essentially suggest that only Marxism offers a solution to the underlying crisis of capitalism, framing Keynesianism as something that ultimately props up the existing structure rather than changing it. It's a real fundamental disagreement on whether reforms can actually fix the system long term.
So Keynesianism offers reforms, but the Marxist view sees them as ultimately inadequate, just delaying the inevitable, perhaps. But what about ideologies that push back against any intervention, like libertarianism? How do our sources address arguments from thinkers like Hayek and Mises? They had some strong critiques of planned economies.
Right, Hayek and Mises are key figures in libertarian thought. They famously developed the economic calculation problem argument. Basically, they argued that a centrally planned economy, like socialism aims for, couldn't possibly work efficiently because it lacks market prices. Without those price signals, they said, there's no way to make rational decisions about allocating resources. It's a pretty powerful critique from their angle.
And how do the Marxist sources respond to that challenge?
Well, the perspective presented in our sources is quite assertive. They claim that Marxists answered these reactionary arguments long ago. The implication is that these critiques of socialism aren't new and have already been addressed within Marxist theory itself. They suggest that the historical materialist approach offers its own complex way of understanding and potentially organizing an economy, one that wouldn't rely on capitalist market signals in the same way.
Interesting. Okay, moving to more recent discussions. We've definitely seen a lot of talk around modern monetary theory, MMT. The sources note it's created a buzz on the left recently. MMT, very broadly, suggests governments that control their own currency aren't really constrained by tax revenue for spending, right? They can spend what's needed for things like full employment, and inflation is the main constraint to watch. How did that fit in here?
The sources we looked at are, frankly, quite dismissive of MMT. They contend that instead of getting caught up in trendy new ideas like MMT, what's really needed is the clear scientific analysis of capitalism that Marxism provides. They argue that MMT, even if it appeals to some on the left, fundamentally misunderstands or ignores the deeper systemic problems of capitalism that Marx identified. So from this view, it offers insufficient, maybe even misleading solutions. They advocate sticking to the established Marxist analytical framework.
Got it. So skepticism towards MMT from this perspective, and one more comparison. What about the idea of long waves, Kondratyev's theory, this idea of like 50-year economic cycles of boom and bust, upswing, downswing, recovery? Almost predictable.
Yeah, it sounds neat, like a rhythm to capitalism. However, the sources present a strong counter-argument from Leon Trotsky, who was obviously a major figure in Marxist thought. Trotsky argued that Kondratyev's idea of these regular, predictable upswings always following downswings, quote, has no solid basis, either in fact or in theory. So from this viewpoint, these aren't reliable cycles promising recovery. Instead, Trotsky emphasized, and the sources echo this, that capitalism was entering a period of overall capitalist decline. This perspective suggests the system isn't just cyclical in a way that implies automatic recovery, but it's in a more fundamental long-term state of decay, a point they feel was borne out by the 2008 financial crisis and everything that followed.
That's a really profound difference in reading economic history, isn't it? Not just cycles, but potential decline. Let's bring this right back to today then. How does this whole framework help us understand what's happening right now? The sources specifically mention the recent rising inflation levels combined with the beginnings of another recession, something we haven't seen together like this for a while. They also talk about capitalism's economic singularities, these potentially game-changing developments in areas like automation, green energy, information tech. How do these modern things connect back to Marx's ideas about productive forces clashing with how society is set up?
Right, this is where the analysis really tries to bridge historical theory and what you're seeing in the news today. The sources argue that these economic singularities, the explosion in automation, AI, rapid IT advances, even the necessary shift to green energy, aren't just cool new technologies. Instead, they see them as precisely the kinds of forces that Marx predicted would, at a certain stage, come into conflict with the way in which society is organized. Take automation, for example. It massively increases productivity, right? Fewer workers can produce way more stuff. On the surface, that seems great, like progress. But within a capitalist system that's driven by profit and relies on workers buying things, it creates a huge contradiction. It potentially worsens the issue of surplus value extraction, less labor needed overall, and can reduce the total purchasing power in the economy relative to this massive productive capacity. So this perspective concludes that these singularities are actually clear evidence that the system is broken. Its ability to produce has outstripped its ability to distribute value fairly or maintain stable jobs for everyone, leading to more instability, not necessarily widespread prosperity.
And flowing from that, the overarching conclusion drawn from our source material seems incredibly stark. It suggests that, from this Marxist viewpoint, there is no way out of this crisis within the confines of capitalism. It sounds like they're saying the system itself is the fundamental problem.
Precisely. The sources are really unequivocal on this point. They argue that the fundamental contradictions Marx identified, that clash between productive forces and social structures, the inherent drive for profit leading to exploitation and crisis, these things just cannot be resolved by tweaking the existing capitalist system. No amount of reform will fix it, according to this view. Instead, the ultimate conclusion presented in the source material is, and I'm quoting here, the only solution is socialist revolution. This is framed not just as a political preference, but as a kind of historical necessity, the only way, in their view, to align our economic organization with the advanced productive capabilities we've developed and thus overcome the system's inherent flaws and crises.
Okay, so we've really covered a lot of ground today in this deep dive into Marxist economics. We trace its roots back to classical thinkers like Smith and Ricardo. We dug into the core concepts, the labor theory of value, surplus value as the source of profit through exploitation, and the idea of inherent crises like overproduction. And we also looked at how this framework engages with, often sharply critiques other major economic theories, Keynesianism, libertarianism, even recent ideas like MMT.
Stepping back, this deep dive really shows how one very comprehensive analytical framework tries to offer not just an explanation for how our economic system works,
Yeah.
but also a very specific interpretation of why crises keep happening and what its ultimate future, its trajectory, might be, according to this theory. It definitely encourages us, I think, to critically examine the economic forces shaping our world, rather than just accepting them as, the way things are.
Absolutely. And this really raises an important question for you, the listener. Given these ideas we've explored today about how value is created, how profits are supposedly generated from unpaid labor, and why crises might be built into the system, how might that change the way you look at your own work, or the goods you consume, or even just the economic news you hear every single day? We hope this deep dive gives you some food for thought and encourages you to continue your own exploration into understanding the complex economy all around us.